Psalm 93, we said poetry many times is using the fewest number of words to convey the most profound thoughts. And this is one of those psalms. It is packed full of majesty and honor of the Lord. It covers a lot of material and ethos, I guess, of the Lord. And it's written, and there's the rest of these psalms, the psalms in this book too, from Psalm 92 through Psalm 100, were psalms that were designed for that second temple. Now, remember the second temple. The first temple was Solomon's temple and so forth, and all the kings were there. Well, then you had the Babylonian captivity, and now the children of Israel have come back, and they, under Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel, and they have reestablished the nation as well as the temple. But there's one glaring omission, and that is they will not have a king, and they will not have a king as far as over Israel. Again, of course, the pseudo-king of Herod, the Herods, but of course until the Messiah comes. So we see now that that as they come back, and since it was Solomon's temple, the inauguration, they had always had a king. And for better or worse, that king presided over the temple proper as far as the protection as well as participation within the worship. And of course with that, with his presence would be all the majesty and the glory that would go on with the king in his presence or with him being around. But now there was no king. And so you see the emphasis now turns inward, and we're talking about the king, the true king of Israel, which is the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we see now as we look at this that these psalms will build up Jehovah, Lord, as king, and the Lord on high, and we've seen the Most High God. We've seen that several times within the last several psalms. And the Most High God, the preeminent one. But now we look at this psalm, and it's short, but my does it have a lot of, if you think about it, it contemplates a lot of scripture. Now we're not going to be going through all of it, but as far as scripture, but he says, the Lord reigns, of course, Jehovah. Now Jehovah is what? The covenant God. He's the God, the relationship God. He's the God who deals with us. Now, of course, the name Elohim is the all-powerful one. Jehovah is the relationship. Genesis chapter 1, Elohim, the all-powerful one. Genesis chapter 2, dealing with man. He was Jehovah, the relationship God. And in his presence, and of course, he deals with it. The Lord Most High, we get all kinds of different revelations of God and his majesty through his names. But here we have the Lord reigns. He is clothed with majesty. He is clothed. He has girded himself with strength. Surely the Lord is established so that it cannot be moved. Excuse me, so the world is established so that it cannot be moved. Your throne is established from of old. You are from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their waves. The Lord on high is mightier than the noise of many waters, than the mighty waves of the sea. Your testimonies are very sure. Holiness adorns your house, O Lord, forever. So here we see a psalm that is written, and of course, the Lord reigns. Now, that wasn't such, it was there, but now the real emphasis is there with the absence of a king. Now, the one thing we as Americans, we have problems with that. Our big symbol is the flag. But I saw just excerpts of I don't watch a lot of movies, but I was watching a little bit of an advertisement or something, but it was a court case in England. And they don't talk about the state, they talk about the crown. And so whenever you have a prosecutor in England, it's the crown. And so the whole thing, and this whole thing with King Charles and all the princes and princesses and all the names and all that. That bores me. I mean, to me, the guys like that just, someone said that, how old is he? 72, 73 years old, and he's finally got a job. But, he was born in a lap of luxury. To me, but then I think I told you one time, I was talking to a British subject. I think he was from South Africa at the time that South Africa was still attached to England. But I just kind of mentioned, though, I've never liked Charles. I mean, even as a young man, I didn't like Charles, and that was 50 years ago. But I never will forget talking about it and just kind of making fun of old Charles because I'd heard something about him. And that really offended that Englishman. And I thought, oh, I better back up because, I don't want to lose good friends simply because, because I think the guy's ugly or whatever, The one thing, I didn't like the way that Charles treated his wife. I mean, here he dates this beautiful girl, but he's already got a mistress on the side and had her before and after he was married. And that just bugs me. Men like that bother me. And especially whenever he had such a beautiful wife, and boy, never, let's not get into that. But anyway, that Camilla, or whatever her name is, she bugs me. But there again, it's the whole idea of the infidelity, the two-facedness, the putting on a front in front of people and being just the opposite and back. And then you find out some of his quirks, like he doesn't. He hugs trees and he talks to flowers, and he allows his servants to put his toothpaste on his brush. I mean, just crazy things like that. That just bug me to pieces about a man. But then again, he's the crown now, especially as he's king. I want to make sure that if any English people are listening tonight, that's just, I'm an American and I'm just not used to it. And I'll try to respect your crown. But just don't stomp on my flag, so those things. So we see that, but the crown was gone. The crown wasn't there. It's gone. What do you do? Yeah, you still got the priest, but that other big part, you had the priestly crown and you had the royal crown. And one of them was missing. And it wasn't going to be restored. And they realized that. And so now the children of Israel and of Judah has to rearrange their whole culture, their thought structure around the fact that they're worshiping God without a king being around, and that they're looking forward to that Messiah coming again. And so it takes generations for that to get embedded into people's minds. And because after all, they've had generations where they had a king, hundreds of years. Now they don't have a king. And so we see that notice how he begins, and the whole psalm starts off, and the theme of the psalm starts off in the first verse. The Lord reigns. Not Solomon reigns, but Jehovah reigns. And so that's the whole theme of the psalm is Jehovah reigns. Oh, well, what about our king? Jehovah reigns. Well, what about David? And what about the six? Jehovah reigns. And so this is what they're going to be trying to do, is drilling it into the people that Jehovah, the relationship God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob before the kings, is still God. So the Lord reigns. He is clothed in majesty. Now, again, to us, we think, whenever they get all that regalia on, that's one thing. But to a person who's under a subject, it's like Isaiah, back in Isaiah chapter 6. The king had died. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. I mean, talking about all that royal. And what was a Jew or an Englishman to do whenever they saw all that royal robe? What would they do? Fall down on their knees. And so just the whole conditioned response. There's the king, fall down before him. And so he's clothed so who's clothed in righteousness? God is, clothed in majesty. And so what are we to do whenever we think of the God of heaven? We fall down before him. let angels prostrate fall. So we see that he says that he is clothed, he has girded himself with strength. And there again, the whole idea of when you see him, his whole person would emanate power and strength. And of course, one word from one of these kings of the Old Testament, especially Nebuchadnezzar and others, one word and you're dead. Take him out, kill him. Well, you can kill him from my presence. I don't like him, whatever. You know what? I mean, that's just, absolute sovereignty over the subjects in front of him. Now, so, the king has had power over life and death. And yet we see that that the Lord reigns. And we're to fall down in front of him. He's clothed. He has girded himself with strength. And so we see that he's clothed in majesty. And notice that he says, surely the world is established and it cannot be moved. So we see that God reigns over creation. And the world is established by him. The world, in this sense, is all the systems of the world, as well as the material evidence of the world. And the foundations we've read about earlier of the world. And so we see that he's established it, and it cannot be moved. Translation, man's not going to change it. And so God has set up the world the way he wants it. And by the way, I'm not worried about global warming with the seas, and most of the politicians aren't either, who own these $12 million mansions along the seacoast, because, they're not worried about global warming. Why should I be? But it's all a power play. The oceans are not going to cover the earth again, because God said he has set them in their positions. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to have a Venice or some surge someplace or around the world. But overall, I'm not worried about a worldwide flood again. Every time I see the true rainbow, God tells me I won't have a flood again. So we see that God has established the world in his majesty and in his strength and in his power. So we see, notice he goes from the Lord, the person, to the position, the throne. And so he says that thy throne, or his throne, is established. There again, when we think of a throne, okay, it's just a chair in the corner. No, your throne, that's your power, that's your seat of power. It's established, and it's established forever. And so he reigns, and he's on that throne forever. When the king, in the year the King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. And so here we see the same picture here of the majesty and the glory and the throne of God. And of course, the book of Revelation talks about thrones more than any other book in the Bible. And it's, of course, with the Lord and his majesty. And so we see that throne will be established forever. And so we see the throne is established from of old. Now, when you see that, think of from the beginning. From all of history, God has established his throne. But then whenever you think of from everlasting, then you've established your throne from of old. That's from creation. You are from everlasting. That's eternity past. In other words, you didn't have a beginning. So we see that the deity of God, or God's deity, is proclaimed here. Yes, you were in the beginning. God created heavens and earth, and so that was of old. But God was already here at the beginning, because what is the beginning? The beginning of time that God decided to create. He says Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, he has set the world in our hearts that we don't know the end from the beginning. In other words, we can't get out of the process of time. What does time mean? Stargate 300 and whatever, Rothenberg. No, they still had a date and so forth. They tried to do away with AD and BC. But yet today, what do we still do? So interesting that we still measure time by God. His birth, before and after. Isn't it interesting how we do that? So we see that God has established time, and there will be a time, or there will be a day when time shall be no more. So, but from everlasting, He's God. So now the next part we see in the verses 1 and 2, then we see that He's established that He's the God over all of creation. But in verses 3 and 4, we see that He rules over the earth. Now, get the context. These children, or these Israelites, or Jews now, again, let me remind you that Jews were not called Jews until the Babylonian captivity. You won't see the word Jew in the Bible until after the Babylonian captivity, because Jew is just a shortened form of Judah, and that was coined during the Babylonian captivity. And of course, it was the nation of Israel, but it was consolidated because Judah was still the main tribe, and people identified with that tribe, even if they were from the tribe of Asher or whatever other tribe. But the ones who had migrated down south to Judah now were considered Jews. And so we see that He tells us that He rules over the earth. The flood has lifted up, O Lord. Now the word floods, if you go back and look at Psalm 46 verses 1 through 3, you look at Isaiah chapter 17, 12, and 13, you look at Daniel chapter 7, 1 through 3, Revelation 13, 1, 17, 15, you'll see that there's always something dealing with the sea and with the ruler that comes out of that sea, or that is represented by the sea. And so that's just a few of the verses where we see it's common in the Old and New Testament to use the sea as rebellion, or as rulers rebelling against God, or nations or societies rebelling against God. And so we see that He says, notice He says it 3 different times. He says the floods, or the seas, or the river, the brooks, or the rivers. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. What happens when it's lifted up? Now, when the Lord is lifted up, of course, He was put on a cross. But when we see that word lifted up, in other words, they bowed up against the Lord. So they lifted them. Remember, we see Satan, Lucifer, and that why art thou lifted up in the morning, son of morning, and so forth, in those passages in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, Isaiah and Ezekiel, that deal with Lucifer, the son of the morning, and how that he's lifted up. And so we see that it means that they defied God. So notice they lifted up, and notice how He says it 3 different times. The floods have lifted up their voice. So they blasphemed God. And again, we see that that beast rising out of the sea in chapter 13 and chapter 17 blasphemes God. And so we see they lift up their voices together. And why do the nations rage? It's Psalm 2. And so they blaspheme together. And notice they've lifted up their waves. I mean, that's power. You know, whenever you ever been knocked down by a wave? How many here has ever been to the ocean? Have you? Did you ever get into the surf enough that it can knock you down? You've been to you have too. Okay. Just, of course, I was born in Florida, and I remember Daytona Beach and the surfing craze that went on and all that kind of stuff, and how that nearly got killed a couple of times by trying to surf in those waters there. But they're powerful, and especially that undertow that can pull you right out to sea. And so the waves and anybody that's been around them. And of course, you say, wait a minute, these people have been over Babylon. That's landlocked. No, but they are back in Israel now. They're back in Judah. And if you listen to Dominic and others, they'll tell you about going out to those wadis, or to those places that just look like dry ground in a valley. And then I think it was Dominic saying the bus driver said, get back into the bus because they've had a rain up in the mountains and the water's going to be coming down. And that water just roars down those mountains and fills those wadis, as they call them, W-A-D-I, just full of water. So you can imagine the rushing of the water. If you've ever been around rushing water again, waterfalls or whatever, you just know the power of it. And so, again, we see that the waves lifted up themselves and they allied themselves together against the Lord. And so the nations rage against the Lord. Now, but notice he says in that, but the Lord, Jehovah, on high, there's that word on high again, the Lord on high is mightier than the oceans. The noise of many waters, and there again, that many waters is those terms, and when you see that, he has a voice of many waters, like you see several times. That's that roar that comes, that overpowering feeling that just rumbles all around you. And the Lord's mightier than that. And so we see that the Lord on high is mightier than the noise of many waters. So go ahead and rage against the Lord. The Lord could outshout you. The Lord could no matter what power. Remember what he says in Psalm 2? He says, why do the nations rage? He that sits in the heavens shall laugh. I mean, he's mightier than they are. He says, you're mightier than the noise of mighty waters, than the mighty waves of the sea, of all their power, not only of their voices, but of all the power. Now, this is where Daniel is such a fantastic book, because you have the greatest and probably one of the most sovereign, if that's the terminology, of all the kings that ever been on the earth was Nebuchadnezzar. He had consolidated world power, and he was cruel, but he was a genius when it came to building and coming to military warfare. People feared him, and he had absolute sovereignty over the people. And even Daniel, remember the outline of history, the golden head. King, you're the sovereign one. There's never going to be anybody as powerful as you are singularly. The Medes and Persians, they weren't as strong. Remember, King Ahasuerus, he made a decree, but then the law of the Medes and Persians, he couldn't change it. So if they could trick him into making it, then there was a law saying that he couldn't change it. Whereas with Nebuchadnezzar, I could do whatever I want to, so because he was king. So we see now that Daniel confronts him several times in the book of Daniel. Chapter 2, of course, is that dream that he had, and I love it. Here he is, a teenage kid, walking before the most powerful man in the world, and he says, "Oh, king, there's a God in heaven." No, wait a minute. No, wait. There's a God in heaven. I like what Elijah did, standing before the king with all the regalia, and he says, "As the Lord God of Israel liveth," and standing there before the king. So here we see in Daniel chapter 5 that the story, of course, of the writing on the wall with Belshazzar, who was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And we see that then Daniel, in verse 12, answered, it's verse 17 of chapter 5 of Daniel. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Yet," in other words, I don't need your, here he is. Now, he's an old man at this time, but he says, "I don't want your gifts." Now, for you to reject the king's gift, you don't do that. That embarrasses the king. Can you imagine, even if President Biden, as much as you might like him or not like him, if he walks in here and says, "Here's something from the White House," and you say, "No, I don't want it," and all those cameras around you, what have you just done to him? You've insulted him. Now, of course, we live in a free country, so his power is limited, but if he was the king, you could be dead in a few seconds. But here he is saying, "Give your gifts and rewards to another, yet I will read the writing to the king and make it known to you. O king, the most high God," There it is. How many times have we seen the Lord Most High in the last few Psalms? Gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom. Notice it wasn't your father or your grandfather that had the kingdom. God gave it to him. And majesty and glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all the peoples, nations, and language trembled and feared before him. So we see that he attributes it to God. Then notice down in verse 21, the last part of that verse, he said, they fed him with grass. Of course, that's when Nebuchadnezzar went crazy or went insane. And grass like heaven, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints over it whomever he chooses. Now, there again, that's not what kings are used to having someone say to them. It's always king whatever you want. No, the Lord Most High does what he chooses, King Belshazzar. So here he is, letting him know, just like Daniel did earlier with his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. Oh King, live forever. I love that later on. But he says to there's a God in heaven. There's a God in heaven. In other words, there's somebody over you. You're not used to hearing that, are you, Nebuchadnezzar? And so that was so interesting how we see those confrontations time and time again in the book of Daniel and elsewhere in the Old Testament. Now, notice how he goes on and just keeps on preaching to this guy. And notice in verse 22, but you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. You knew what happened with Nebuchadnezzar. You saw it. You were probably a young child. And you saw and you remember and you heard about how that, or the fiery furnace, or you heard about how that he went insane, and yet God kept his kingdom together and raised him back up. And you knew all this. And you have lifted up yourself. There's that idea of lifting up. You've lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels into his house before you. And you, of course, remember how that he did all that. But then he says, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Boy, isn't that strong? That's one thing for him to say it to me. It's another thing to say it to a king that could have killed him at any moment. Or a king that could have, so there again. But he was saying, hey, you're going to die tonight, king, because my king tells you that you are. And so, here's this absolute authority over life and death. And I love that, where the God who holds your breath, God even gives you the breath to blaspheme him. Think about it. So, the absolute sovereignty of God. So this is what he's talking about. You're mightier than the waves of the sea. You are bigger than even Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, these children, or these people, many of them within their lifetimes have remembered Nebuchadnezzar. They would remember what the psalmist is writing here, and that God is mightier than those kings. And so we see that he is mightier than their noise, their boisterous, and their power. Belshazzar was making a big noise, and then his knees started knocking, and that was a big noise too. And then, of course, we see his power. But then the last verse, we see that God resides among his people. There it is. We see again, your testimonies. That's whatever you've said to me, your word, your revelations, the things that you have said are your testimony. They're your statements of fact. These are the things that you have revealed to us. And that is, your testimonies are very sure. we can say whatever God says is so, right? So we see that, so his promises, his testimonies, his statements, his revelations are very sure. God says what he means and means what he says. Absolutely. Absolute power. Absolute intelligence. Absolute dignity and honor. And so he says what he means, and he means what he says. Holiness adorns your house. There again, he's talking about, of course, that's where God dwells. But earlier in the psalm, we see that God dwells in his tabernacle, and everything in that tabernacle says holy. And so we see that that his house, of course, there can be no sin in my Father's house where there's joy, joy, joy. We need to learn some of these courses. We need to relearn some of these. But some of these songs, sweetheart, I think that we knew as kids, we haven't been teaching people here. So we got to, do you remember that song? There can be no sin in my Father's house. And so songs like that where God is, where there's, his promises are sure, his house is ordained. I know I shall see in his beauty the King in whose law I delight, who lovingly guardeth my footsteps and giveth me songs in the night. Why? Because he's holy. He's good. He's beautiful. He's majestic. He's powerful. And so his holiness adorns his house, and his house is his dwelling. And his house figuratively also means, my house means not just where I live, but where I preside, and my wife lives in my house. My children one day lived in my house. And so if you talked about the house of Daniel, then you were talking about my wife and my kids. And so the Bible tells me that I have been accepted into his beloved. Ephesians chapter 1. I'm in his house. And so are you, if you're in the household of God. And then, of course, he uses the term like household of God and so forth. So holiness adorns his house, and we adorn him when we allow him to make us holy. But also, his presence is forever. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him or on him or into him should not perish, but what? Have everlasting life. It's not that you will have it, it's that you do have it. And so, and notice we begin with that, O Lord reigns with majesty, and it's from everlasting, eternal past to now eternal future. So, eternity past to eternity future. So, not worried, and I'm glad. It's interesting how so many times these Psalms, as I study them, it'll catch me when I'm down, or it'll catch me when I'm looking at something that frustrates me in the world, and it starts correcting me. I mean, I've just been hearing a series of frustrating news lately. If it's not a loved one or someone that I know very well that is passing away, it's something about two good men that are in Christian circles that are having major disagreements, or it's about the corruption, the utter corruption and the dishonesty and the lawlessness that's in our government, and how that good men are being crushed. And you hear a constant of that, and it'll get you down. But there's a God in heaven. You got to turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of this world will grow. What? Strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. That's what we need, isn't it? The Lord reigns. He is clothed with majesty. Let's see the King in his beauty. Amen? Okay, any comments or questions about what we've looked at tonight? We serve a big God, a powerful God, a beautiful God, the God of heaven, who created. I love that. My next breath depends on him. It's just amazing. And your next car sale depends on him too.